So this is the third lecture of Unit 4, the third lecture on memory. We've got one more lecture on memory here as we go forward, we've talked about sensory memory, we've talked about short-term memory, we've talked about encoding and storage. Now what we're going to talk a little bit more is long-term memory. We're going to talk a little bit more about storage, but we're also going to talk about getting memories out of storage and some of the things that get in our way of that. So this is Unit 4. Lecture 3. So let's talk about what we talked about so far. Remember, 3-step process of memory is you have to encode the information, you have to store the information, you have to retrieve the information. And in that encoding portion to store it, we talked about your sensory memory, which it lasts for about half a second. Everything we're experiencing, 2 billion bits of information going around. And if we don't pay attention to those 2 billion bits of information, that information is lost because there's no reason to hold on to it. But then if we encode that and we start to pay attention to it, a phone number, whatever else the case may be, something we repeat to ourselves, 713-785-4227 again and again and again, that stays in our short-term memory. But then once I use it, it gets thrown away again. Hey, look, gas is 325 over here. Okay, well, I don't need any gas. So the idea that I saw that gas was 325 and I was paying attention to that, throw it away, don't need it. But if I do need it, then I got to take it from short-term memory, work it through my hippocampus, then we encode it into a long-term memory. And we talked about the different ways that we can take things from short-term and put them into long-term memory. If it's chunking, if it's making it part of a story, if it's making about something I already know, all the elaborate rehearsal, puts it into long-term memory. But then once I put it into long-term memory, I've got to pull it out and retrieve it and pay attention to it again and put it back into short-term memory. And that's what we're going to talk about here. So again, we talked about declarative memories. And remember, declarative memories are things that we're consciously aware of. We talked about declarative memories are things like, what is the capital of Texas? It's Austin. It's episodic memories, you know, the time when I was in Austin, Texas, anything like that. So those are explicit declarative memories. Today, we're going to take a look at what are called implicit memories, non-declarative memories. And these are memories that just sort of we make without trying, okay? They can include moods that we're in. They can include conditioning. They can include priming and all these things. The reason that we're suddenly feeling scared in a situation, the reason we're in a bad mood and we don't know why we're in a bad mood. You know, when you're using a second language, you don't turn off the first language, but you just immediately pick that stuff up. Now, many of us who speak English and have been speaking it since we were young kids, we don't remember learning to speak English. We don't remember learning how to walk. We can just do it. And these are non-declarative memories. But this can also include implicit biases that we have with or even without being consciously aware of them. And these are just all things that through experience or whatever, good situations, bad situations, sometimes can sort of lead us to different behaviors. Procedural memory also includes motor memory. These are motor skills that we learn. We've talked about this being in the back of the cerebellum. We don't want to get up here in the frontal lobe. Your coach saying, don't think about it, just shoot. These are things that we pick up and we don't think about. You're shooting a basketball. You're not thinking, okay, my arms have to come up. You do it again and again and again, which is why coaches have you run drills. It's retention without thinking about it. It's when you're texting a message and you're just like, you're just seeing the words pop up and you don't know what your thumbs are doing. When you're just typing, if I asked you, if I put a blank keyboard in front of you right now and just said, as fast as you can, point to the S button, might be hard for us to do. We kind of have to type Steven, okay, it would be there because we automatically do this stuff. And those are motor memories located again back in the cerebellum, part of implicit non-declarative memories. Other implicit non-declarative memories include associative memories, dispositions, moods that we're in, the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder that we talked about previously when we were talking about stress. Test-taking anxiety, just sitting for a test, the fact that some people make you nervous, not liking a person because of a past experience with another person, listening to music from your childhood that you associate with a good time, or listening to a song that you associate with a bad time, salivating at the smell of cookies, or just walking into your grandparents' house and you associate that with good times. We'll talk about this more in Unit 6 when we get to conditioning. You know, the idea that Pavlov had these dogs who would salivate when they saw food, which is a natural thing for us to do. That's not a memory. But then what would happen, they would ring a bell. Doesn't cause salivation, but then they ring a bell every time they fed them. Then the dog would start to associate the bell with food. When the dog associates a leash with going for a walk, and it puts them in a good mood, just seeing the leash. But if they never make that association, you don't create that memory. Now, again, emotions can impact our memory and our storage. Infantile amnesia, back to episodic memories. Our earliest episodic declarative memories that we have don't tend to happen prior to the age of 3. Okay. And 4, maybe 3 or 4 are our earliest memories. And if you think back to your earliest memory, if I said go back to your earliest memory that you've ever had, for most of you, your earliest memory is going to be something about I fell down and I hurt myself. I got lost at a mall. I got in trouble at nursery school. There's going to be some excitement to it. There's going to be some pain to it. There's going to be some sort of an emergency to it, because usually our amygdala becomes a part of it. And the reason that we have memories of this, whether you got lost in a mall, whether you hurt yourself, whether you were in an ambulance, going to a hospital, whatever, it's your amygdala making that memory strong because emotions are involved in it. And you don't want to be put into that situation again. Now, again, a 3-year-old can remember what they did last week. But by the time we get to be 8 or 9, it's hard to remember being before the age of 4, because now it's hard to think like a 3-year-old. A 3-year-old can remember what happened last week or 2 weeks ago or a month ago or even last year because they're excited for Halloween this year. But once you get to be 7, 8, 9, then it's hard to remember being 2 or 3 because you're not thinking like a 3-year-old. And then by the time you become a teenager, your earliest real memories are about being 4 or 5 years of age. And again, they tend to be linked to emotion. Most vivid memories, including our earliest ones, have something to do with emotions because we don't want to get caught into that situation again. And stressful events tend to be recalled more often. Bad things tend to be recalled more often. So of course that memory is going to stick with us a little bit more, even if it is sometimes pretty inaccurate. Now, episodic memories, again, part of our declarative memories. This is a specific event that happens in our lives. But the trick again is each time we recall an episodic memory, we put it back a little bit differently. When you tell the story to your friend about what happened last period, you add a little here, you take a little there. And what you're doing now is you got that memory, but as you're saying it, and then you put it back, you're putting back that new version of the memory. So the next time you recall the memory, it's not specifically recalling that memory, it's recalling the last time that I remembered that memory. And the episodic memory is probably the most vulnerable of all of our memories to actually be wrong. Okay, now a type of this episodic memory is what is called a flashbulb memory. And a flashbulb memory tends to be a very emotional memory. This is a clear memory. And again, this could be a group emotional memory where were you at September 11th or whatever else the case may be. Of course, for you guys, a little bit too young for that. But people can remember what they were doing September 11th, September 10th of 2001, a little bit harder. But we have these personal milestones that are our episodic memories. Your first day of school, if you were in a car accident, your first kiss, prom night, a proposal, a wedding day, anything like that. It's a memory we go back to again and again and again. Could be very happy, could be very tragic, but it's something that we go back to each and every time. But the trick is, and I'm sure you've noticed this, if you've ever asked your parents or your grandparents, hey, can you remember your first date? Can you remember when you met each other? I'm sure over the years, the story has made some evolvement. Some details might have changed a little bit or whatever, If dad kicked the game-winning field goal in a game, it probably happened during a scrimmage, but each time he tells the story, no, it was during the regular season. No, it was during the playoffs. No, it wasn't a 19-yard field goal. It was a 29. No, it was a 39. It must have been a 59-yard field goal. And each time it comes back. And then what happens when we go back to that memory again and again and again, we start to believe these additions that we put into it. So as a result, what happens is our flashbulb memories tend to be very vivid because we keep going back to them, but they also become less accurate because we keep reliving and retelling it again. And due to this reliving and retelling it and pulling this memory from all these different parts of our brain, it's not going to be as accurate. So again, episodic memories that are flashbulb memories are very, very, very vivid, especially compared to other memories. But the accuracy is less. The consistency is less. The consistency goes down with flashbulb memories much more than everyday memories. Now, long-term potential is this idea of changes that happen in our brain. Every moment that we're experiencing something, these inner neurons are making these connections. And each time we do things, every time that I walk, I'm making those synapse connections more efficient. Each time that I talk, each time that I snap my fingers, I become better at it because I'm traveling that route again and again and again and again and again. So this is learning in action. So the more times I go down, move it over here, the more times I go down this grassy road, the more efficient that road becomes until it becomes a very, very changed highway. So when you're talking about long-term potential, when it has to do with memory, you're talking about physical changes that happen in your brain as more neural connections are being made. Now, it can get wiped out a little bit if you never do make that connection. Somebody gets into a car accident, somebody gets knocked out of a football game. They never take it from short term and put it into long-term memory. And as a result, they can't make that neural change. Alcohol can have an effect on it because it has an impact on serotonin and other neurotransmitters. And that gets in the way of making these connections. And also, kind of loses where we put the memory, which is why sometimes when someone's been drinking for a while and they get up sober the next day, they can't remember what happened the night before until they drink again. And then suddenly that memory comes back, and that is sort of a state-dependent memory, which we're going to talk about here in a couple of minutes. All right, so long-term potential is the actual physical change that happens in your brain as these neurons are being connected. And that's really a big missed question. So again, other things with long-term potential, Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease, it's not so much that we lose memories, but we lose the route to the memory. We lose the pathway. The grass grows back over, the bridge becomes broken, and we can't find memories that we have. All right, so it's not that memories just deteriorate. It's just we can't find it. Like the class ring I talked about a couple of lectures ago. It exists. It's somewhere in this world, but if I can't find it, it doesn't do me any good. If I download a song onto my computer and I can't find that file, I've got the song in my computer. Doesn't do me any good. Something else that hurts my ability to both make and encode memories as well as retrieve them is sleep deprivation. When I lose sleep, my memory becomes worse. It's either less efficient going to the memory and sometimes less efficient putting the memory away, which is why sometimes the best thing that you can do, to study for a test is go to sleep. Go to sleep. Let your brain reconstruct. Let your brain make those neural connections. Let your brain do damage control and all these other things. You got to give the brain some downtime where it can relax and it can make the neural connections that you've made more efficient. Make sure that it's taken care of. All right. some stuff there on rewiring the brain and neurotransmitters. So we've talked about sensory memory, 2 billion bits of information. If I don't need it and it doesn't go to short-term memory, I just throw it away. Then we go to short-term memory. These are things that I'm paying attention to. If I need it, I put it into long-term memory. I'm going to repeat it again and again and again until I put it into long-term memory. And then if I don't need it, I'll just go ahead and lose it there. So then we encode the information. And so we put it into long-term memory. Now, once memories are put into long-term memory, now I got to bring them out of long-term memory. And this is where a lot of changes can happen. And this is what is referred to as recall and recognition. Recall is trying to find a memory that I've placed without any sort of cue or hint. It's just like trying to remember things. And remember, 30 to 40% of what we think of consciously is not in our control. We just sort of randomly think it, okay? So recall is trying to work my way through all of my memories. This is why you don't like fill in the blank test. This is why you don't like a multiple choice test with a none of the above option, because that none of the above option means it could be anything versus multiple choice. It's got to be one of these. If I told you to get out a piece of paper and list the name of every kid that you went to kindergarten with, that'd be pretty hard for you to do. As a matter of fact, let's say you went to kindergarten with 25 kids. I'd be surprised if many of you could get 4, 5, 6 names correct on that. Yet if I gave you a list of 100 names and I said, pick which one of them, you'd do a little bit better. If I gave you pictures of kids with their name, you'd probably do a little bit better. It's easier to recognize, but the recall is going through all of your memory. And this rapidly declines within the first 24 hours because what happens is I'm going to experience this moment right here, but I'm also going to experience the next moment, which is going to get in the way of that. So it's going to be harder. And it's just like geology. Our memories get buried and buried and buried and buried and buried. And if I don't go down and bring them up back up to the top, it's hard for me to dig through that like Indiana Jones. Now, this is also why younger people have an easier time with recall because they have fewer memories. I'm 53 years old, and being 53 years of age, I got to sift through a bunch of stuff. If you ask me, what was I doing when I was 29? First off, I got to think, okay, what year was I 29 at? I was born in 68, so 30 years would have been 98. 29 would have been 97. So 97, I think I'm living in Toledo. It's hard for me to just get to 29. I got to sort of work. I got to sift through all these other memories. And what was the difference between 29 and 31? It's going to take some thinking. But to ask you the difference between you being 13 and 15 is going to be a whole lot easier for you to come up with because you don't have this big bucket of memories that I've got. And it's going to be even easier for a kid who's 7 because they don't have as big of a bucket of memory. So as you get older, recall does become more difficult. What's easier for us is something called recognition. And recognition is that multiple choice test. Recognition, we tend to do better with recognition than we do recall. You see recognition test scores versus recalls is a multiple choice test versus a fill in the blank. Because again, fill in the blank, you got to go through your entire brain versus, recognition. I just have to look at a particular answer. Better with pictures than it is with words, even better if we're using both. Usually it takes 10 to 15 seconds. If you're taking longer than 10 to 15 seconds to come up with an answer, you're not using recognition. And this is why, if you're taking a test question and you're on number 13 and you go, okay, there's a question. Is it A? Is it B? Is it C? Is it D? It's C. That means you know the answer. If you're sitting there going, okay, well, it's not B, it could be A, might be C, it could be D, but I know it's not E. So it's either A, C, or D. It's you don't know the answer. Because now what you're doing is you're comparing C to D and D to A and A to C. So this is more doing logical guessing. That's why if a kid's taking a 50 question test for me and they finish it in 20 minutes, I'm not too freaked out about it. A lot of teachers go, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure? Yeah, I know the answers. That's why I finished it kind of quickly. But the other problem with recognition is we're very susceptible to suggestion. If you're not quite sure what it is and you didn't really study for the test and you put C down for 13 and you look over there and they put B and you look over there and they put B and they put B, you're going to change it. Because again, you're not so sure about your memory, and well, they must be right. And even the weirdest things, especially Scantron tests. I mean, how many times does this happen to you? You're like, I've got too many B's. That's like 5 B's in a row. The next one can't possibly be B. So now in your mind, when you're taking the next question, you're just eliminating B off the top because it couldn't possibly be this many B's. You want the world to even out, but I'm here to tell you it doesn't even out. As a matter of fact, that as a teacher, if I told you on this test, 50 questions, 10 would be A, 10 will be B, 10 will be C, 10 will be T, 10 will be E, that would screw you over so bad because then you'd be trying to make the perfect test. I mean, you've even done this. Okay, 11 is A, 12 is B, 13 is C, and you're starting to get excited. Up, 14 is D, come on, go to E, and I went all the way across, and we feel good. Like this test has a pattern. This test makes sense. But that impacts how we get to information, which has nothing to do with each question is independent of the other. And it has nothing to do with the other. So we become very susceptible to that stuff. And by the way, changing your answers. This is where teachers go, don't change your answer because your first answer is usually right. Well, not if you don't think it is. If you don't think it is, there's a reason you're changing it. Maybe you misread the question. Maybe you got to question 32 and that sort of alerted you to what the question to 16 was. And a lot of times we don't want to change our answer because when we change our answer, we remember the times where we changed it from the wrong to the right, because when we change it from the wrong to the right, that hurt. We got penalized. We got punished. It's like, oh, I had the right answer. Oh, and that hurt. So we remember all the times that happened. But it doesn't happen that often. We don't remember the times where we change it from the wrong answer to the right answer because we're like, well, I just misread it. And that's what happens most of the time. Most of the time. Most people think that if I change my answer, I'm going to hurt the score, 55%. But in reality, when people change their answers, 57% of the time, nearly 2/3, 57% of the time, you change it from the wrong answer to the right answer. Only 20% of the time, 1 out of 5 times, you actually change it from the right to the wrong answer, and 22% of the time it's wrong to wrong because you have no idea. But since we remember the times that it hurt us, we think it's happening more often than what it is. And this is known as the availability heuristic, which we'll talk about when we get to learning and thinking. Changing your answer is usually the result of misreading the question. It's usually the result of answering later questions that semantically relate to this old question. This will improve your score 58% of the time. Those are pretty good odds. Don't just change it to change it, but if you feel like you should change it because you probably should. You probably should. Relearning. And this is a kind of an obvious thing, but the amount of time is saved when we relearn previously learned material. It's quicker to relearn something. I was with my kids just 4 days ago. My kids showed up and from Nacogdoches, and they said, hey, you guys got the game of life? I'm like, you know what? I think we do have the game of life, with little cars and the people and the kids, and you work around and you go through life. And they wanted to play the game of life. And so we played it. I haven't played it since I was 11 years old. And it took a second. I had to get the rules of it, but it wasn't, I knew the general gist of it. And it was pretty easy to relearn the game's the rules of life. And what was funny about it is we were getting confused and trying to figure out, we look at, this does say 9+, and we've got 4 people here with college degrees that 3 of us with masters that can't figure this out. But it's easier. It's easier to relearn something than it is to learn something for the first time. Okay, Evan Egas showed this to be true with his forgetting curve, where he basically gave people random things, and the more time that they spent on day 1, the less time that they would have to spend on day 2 to relearn that information. He also figured out other things like the next in line effect. When people are going around in a circle reading words or saying names or porous memories of the person right in front of them because they haven't processed it as long as the other ones have been repeated again and again and again. Information presented right before we go to sleep is rarely remembered, which is why you should not study and fall asleep, because you're not going to process that information. Also, the idea of osmosis, taped information played while we're asleep, never remembered because we never process it. Okay, he talked about this idea of a forgetting curve. Of what happens is when we first learn something, pretty early on, we're going to start to forget that stuff. And what happens is, and it's really, really quick early on, the first day or so, we're only going to remember 30% of what happened the day before. By the end of the day, we only remember 60% of what happened that day. The next day, we only remember 30% of what happened yesterday. And as a week goes by, it gets a little bit less. And then what we do is we kind of put together a highlight package. And then by the end of the month, we've got about 20% of any particular day. And then once we get past that month and we go from there down to a year, after about a year, it gets down to 70%. By 3 years, it gets to 30%. But then again, it levels off and it stays pretty much the same because you put together a highlight package. If you ask me what I remember about my Spanish class, my sophomore year of high school, what I remember today as someone who's 53 is about the same as what I remembered from when I was 23. It just sort of levels off. So when I was 23, that was what, 6, 7 years later, and now it's 7 years later, it levels off by that particular time. Something else that can affect our memory is also something called priming. And priming is how we retrieve information in a Google search. If I were to sit here and talk about bunny rabbits and Bugs Bunny and bunny, and rabbits, and show you a picture of a rabbit, and I mentioned a hare, you would most likely be thinking of a rabbit instead of hair from the head because you've been primed to think about that. If you just read a paragraph that contained the word ocean, then I said, here, choose a detergent, you're more likely to choose Tide because ocean's in your mind. This is sort of the memoryless memory that mind readers use to sort of influence you to a particular thing. You walk past a poster of a missing child and now you're primed that any adult-child interaction you see, you don't become very trusting about. People primed with words about saving money. You send 2 different people to 2 different seminars, and one goes to a seminar about saving money and retirement and all these other things. And you send another person to a seminar, and this seminar is about helping your fellow man and all those other things that go with that. And then they go out and they see a bunch of homeless people. The person who went to the help your fellow man is far more likely to give to homeless people than the person who just went to the seminar about saving for the future. We're primed with these particular words. We're primed with particular things. I now drive a Ford Fusion. Okay, I have never really heard of a Ford Fusion before. I never noticed a Ford Fusion until 3 or 4 years ago when I bought one. And now every Ford Fusion, it just pops out to me. Same thing with my wife, because she now is looking, is that me in my car? And it's the same thing with the car. She drives a Jeep Cherokee, a car that I had no reason to pay any attention to out on the road. But now that my wife drives one, I see them all the time. They stick out to me. Conservatives are primed to find success for President Trump. Liberals are primed to find faults with him because we want to be reinforced with, did I vote for the right person? In the last election, you take a Google terms for fake news. Fake news was not a term for years and years and years and years. And then suddenly we hit the election of 2016 and it's put into our head. And now we're primed. We find one story that might have been a little bit off. And now we're primed that all the news is fake or conspiracies or anything like that. That's part of priming. Context can have a lot to do with our memory. The fact that if you are sitting in the classroom learning this information from me, and then I have you take the test in the same classroom, you're going to do better than if I say, hey, everybody, let's go down to the Commons and let's take our test down there today. This isn't the place where I learn the material. They did a study where they had people learn vocabulary words. These people learned it on land, were tested on land. These people learned it underwater, were tested underwater. These people learned it on land, tested underwater. These people learned it underwater, tested on land, scuba equipment, whatever else. And as a result, if I'm where I was when I made the memory, it's going to come back to me better. Context has everything to do with it. When you go back to your old elementary school and suddenly the memories of being in elementary school start to come back to you, context is everything. Doorways have a huge effect on memory. How many times have you been in your bedroom and you're like, I'm going to go downstairs, I'm going to get a cookie. Then you walk down to the kitchen, you look around and you're like, what the hell am I doing down here? Why did I come down here? Then you go back up into your room. It's like, oh, that's right, I wanted a cookie. Because in your room is where you made the idea of wanting a cookie. And so it's easy to recall it in your room, harder to recall it in the kitchen, which is why sometimes we got to repeat things to ourselves again and again and again and again and again. This is also why drug addicts are told that one of the things that you have to do when you quit the addiction is you got to quit hanging around with those friends, because those friends are going to remind you of the addiction. You take a drug addict back to the old crack house that they used to be at, where they would satisfy their urge, and the urge is going to become unbelievable being there. So sometimes you got to leave town, you got to go to another place. So all of these things are part of this context dependent memory that gets us in things. If you take a look at my my iTunes is basically, see if I can bring up my iTunes here real quick. My iTunes is, if you take a look at, okay, here, my playlist. Wonder if I can bring this up here. It's my iTunes over here. If you look at my playlist, is this going to show up on the camera? Not well, maybe a little bit. If you look at my playlist, let me see if I can pop this open a little bit more. Really should have figured this out sooner. Okay. Trying to do this with my left hand. All right, okay, maybe there. Okay, so if you look at the playlist, you'll notice over on the playlist, which is over here, that I have my playlist broken down by high school. I've got a Finley 84 to 86 playlist, or 79 to 84 playlist, and that reminds me of high school. And I've got another playlist here. One of them is 70s pop. One is 79 to 84 junior high school. One's 84 to 86 Houston high school. One's 87 to 91 college. One is 90 to 94 Houston. One's 95 to 2000 Lima Toledo, because those particular songs put me in the particular memory of that particular time. Whether I was working as a radio DJ back in the 90s, or whether I was in high school in Ohio versus being in high school in Texas, we hear those songs and it takes us back to those memories. Context is everything. State dependent memory. What is learned in one state? What we learn when we're happy, we're going to recall when we're happy. What we learned when we're sad or experience when we were sad, we're going to remember when we're sad. And again, this is why drunk people can't remember what they did when they sober up. Drugs can interfere with encoding, and alcohol disrupts the storage, and it sort of gets in our way. State of mind, they're stored in a certain part of our brain. Stress can relive feelings due to PTSD, due to anxiety. So when we're stressed, we remember more things that make us stressed. And again, this is what's so messed up about disorders like anxiety. When you're feeling anxious, it's hard for us to recall times when we weren't anxious. When we're in a depressed state, it's hard to remember the times when we were feeling okay, because our mind is in that depressed state. And so we think it's going to last forever. We think the anxiety is going to last forever, because we can't remember the good days, and that's why sometimes when you're having a good day, you need to sit here and go, this is a good day. I need to remember this. I need to take some pictures of this, because I need to recall when life is good. Using context and state dependent memory on your test, there's an easy way to do this. One way to do it is choose a certain flavor of gum, choose a certain mint or whatever else the case may be, Altoid, whatnot. And then while you're studying for that class, take that specific, let's say you use Wrigley Spearmint gum for psychology. So every time you're in psychology class, and only in psychology class, choose Wrigley Spearmint gum. When you're at home studying for psychology, chew Wrigley Spearmint gum. Then when you get into class, chew Wrigley Spearmint gum. And what's going to happen, you're going to have an easier time recalling that stuff, because you're going to be experiencing the gum that you've associated with all of these particular memories. Mood can have a huge thing to do with your memory. You ever notice this? You ever notice that when you get in trouble with your parents, you screwed up and you've done whatever, that moment that you screw up, suddenly your parents remember every bad thing that you've done since the beginning of time. This is because when we get into a good mood, all the good memories come out. When we get into a bad mood, it's like, oh, you did that, you screwed up, you didn't do the dishes. It's like the time I asked you to take out the trash and you didn't do that, and you're just in the bad file. Or you get in the good file, which again is why I'm not here to tell you how to manipulate your parents, but do something nice. Clean your room for no reason. Clean up the house, vacuum for no reason before you ask for permission for something, because then they're going to remember the times when you were good. Okay. And again, how you describe your parents today can depend on your mood. It may not be how you would have described them 6 weeks ago, 6 days ago, 6 hours ago. It all depends on what's happened during that time. So again, our moods can have a huge impact on how we pull out those memories, and not just how we pull out those memories, how we put the memories away. Again, you find out your boyfriend, girlfriend cheated on you, all these happy, good memories you have for them, and now you're in a bad mood, you pull them out, you just taint them with badness now before you put them back away. And again, it's the same thing that happened, but that memory is now entirely different. And mood can also affect something called nostalgia. Nostalgia is when we go back and we look at the past. And people who are nostalgic tend to have very happiness of fond memories, along with the sad realization that that may never happen again. You know, when you got people living in the past, oh yeah, back in junior high, oh, back in high school, oh, remember the day back then? And the thing is as happy as those memories make them, it can also make them sad because they think they're never going to go back to that time again. And there's closure and it's over and that person's found someone else or whatever. Mood can have a huge impact on our memory. Last thing we got to talk about here today in this lecture is something called the serial position effect. The serial position effect, which is also known as a recency primacy effect or the ABC-XYZ effect, is that we tend to remember the beginning of things, we tend to remember the end of things, because the things in the middle a little bit harder. If I gave you a list of things to get at the grocery store, you would remember the first few things on the list because you were paying attention. Oh, we need things from the grocery store. And the last few things, because those were the last things that I told you, stuff in the middle will be a little bit harder. I ask you about a movie, you can tell me how the movie started. You can tell me how the movie ended, but the stuff in the middle of the movie, a little bit harder to remember. Beginning, end, pretty good. Stuff in the middle, a little bit harder. Beginning, end, paying attention, happened most recently. Stuff in the middle, a little bit harder. And you can see this when you've had friends who are trying to sing along to a song, and they know the beginning of the song, the end of the song, stuff in the middle. Last Friday night, and they know how it ends because of the rhyme that goes with it. But this little things in the middle, it just becomes a lot harder. So the beginning of the list, because I'm paying attention, end of the list, because it was just said, middle of the list, a little bit more difficult. All right, so that gets us through lecture 3 on memory. One more lecture on memory, and then we're going to get into some things on states of consciousness. So that wraps us up for this lecture.